Hannah Arendt famously declared that Kant didn't have a political philosophy. She didn't think much of his few short political essays, and argued that Kant himself didn't even take them seriously. It's true that a lot of what Kant has to say about political institutions is presented as a legal philosophy in the form of a determination of right. This work, presented in A Doctrine of Right, the first book of the Metaphysics of Morals, has long been ignored even by Kant scholars. After reading the text, Schopenhauer asserted that it was as if it were not the work of a great man, but the product of an ordinary common man. As a result, Kant's political and legal philosophy is far less well known than his writings on epistemology and ethics. In this video, we'll examine a number of his shorter but important essays to uncover Kant's republicanism, his cosmopolitanism, and his theory of the gradual improvement of humanity through the public use of our reason. I'm James Muldoon. I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter, and this is an introduction to Kant's political philosophy. Kant's life. Immanuel Kant was born on 22nd of April 1724 in the Prussian town of Königsberg. His family was from a modest background and were deeply religious and very strict. He was brought up as a pietist, and his family stressed religious devotion and instruction in the Bible. He was a bright student who attended the University of Königsberg at the age of 16, where he would spend his entire career as a philosopher. There's a story about Kant that he used to take a daily walk with such regularity that the people of Königsberg could set their clocks to it. This gives you the image of a boring academic and doesn't do very much for the Germans' reputation for order and Pünktlichkeit. But this doesn't give you a complete picture of Kant's character. He had many friends, he enjoyed wearing colourful shirts, and he had great banter at dinner parties. He became a university lecturer in 1755 and was a popular teacher at the university. Kant is now most famous for his system of transcendental idealism that he developed in his three critiques. But he only wrote this in his late 50s after wanting to respond to the philosophical problem of skepticism. In 1781, Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason, which at 800 pages long gained few adherents or supporters. It was only later in 1786 when another philosopher, Karl Reinhold, published a series of letters on Kantian philosophy that his work gained popularity. Kant soon became the most well-known philosopher in Germany and published the Critique of Practical Reason, a Critique of Judgment, and the Metaphysics of Morals. His political writings are relatively less well known than his work on metaphysics and ethics. When he died at the age of 80 in 1804, his philosophical system had set the stage for the development of continental philosophy for the next century. Kant's philosophy. Kant thought that we had a natural tendency to go beyond our own limits of what human reason could do and to speculate on things that we couldn't possibly know anything about. His philosophical project was to establish the necessary limits on our reason. This involved reorienting philosophy from the question of what is there in the world or what is being, to the more preliminary question of how can I know? The rationalist tradition before Kant sought to discern universal and timeless truths in nature. Kant, on the other hand, was concerned with how things appear to us human beings as sensuous and rational creatures. The main thesis of Kant's philosophy was that we can only know appearances, or how things appear to us. He created a structure of how our minds must operate given how we experience the world. In other words, his philosophy is an examination of the conditions that make human experience possible. He sought to discover the universal laws of how our minds were structured by categories like time and space. The Kantian revolution in philosophy was to show that structures like time and space were not properties of a world out there, but rather necessary features of our cognitive faculties. We see the world as governed by Newtonian physics because it's part of the structure of our brains. There's no objective view from nowhere from which we could see things in themselves. For Kant, there's only the limited perspective of our finite human experience. The most important point for our purposes is that this philosophical project sought to show that we were governed by reason. Reason was the basis of our theoretical knowledge, and it was also the basis of how we should act in the world. He divided philosophy into its theoretical and practical components and thought that politics was a branch of practical philosophy, addressing questions of how we should act. Practical philosophy. Kant's practical philosophy is guided by the idea that our morality must be based on a certain and universal foundation of reason. In Groundwork of a Metaphysics of Morals, Kant sought to show how an important part of our moral philosophy could be separated from empirical considerations. For an action to be moral for Kant, it had to accord with a moral law of reason that could be determined without any reference to empirical reality. An action's moral value doesn't lie in its effect, but in the ground for acting. As rational beings, we have a will, which for Kant meant that we could act in accordance with principles. He proposed the following universal law to be the basis of our morality. This is what Kant called the categorical imperative, the idea that I should only do something if I would be happy to make a principle based on my action a universal law that everyone should follow. Kant thought that we were most free not when we were doing whatever we want, but when we followed a moral law. He was influenced by Rousseau's idea of autonomy, that freedom is obedience to rational laws of our own making. The groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals was intended as a preparatory book for a future Metaphysics of Morals, which was published 12 years later. The first part, the Doctrine of Right, has the categorical imperative as its highest principle. Freedom in the state. Kant believed that moral agents would be best able to live a moral life under a constitutional state, or a state of rights, from the German term Rechtsstaat. This meant a state in which government power was constrained by the rule of law to protect citizens from the exercise of arbitrary power. His reasoning for this is as follows. As moral agents, individuals should be self-governing. We should also treat other human beings as self-governing rational agents. He thought we had a right to coerce others to guarantee an external sphere in which we could act unimpeded. But because we would all want to have this right, we require an independent body to ensure that any coercion follows universal rules which treat everybody impartially. The state as the enforcer of the law thus has freedom as its basic principle. Its role is to resolve disputes about property rights and ensure compliance with its decisions. The state's role would thus be to enforce what Kant calls right. Right is the restriction of each individual's freedom so that it harmonizes with the freedom of everyone else. Kant stated that such a state should be governed by the following three principles. First, the freedom of every member of the state as a human being. Second, the equality of each with every other as a subject. Third, the independence of every member of the Commonwealth as a citizen. If these three principles were followed in a constitutional state, then each person, as their own moral agent, could pursue their own path to happiness without being coerced by others. This is what Kant called his Doctrine of Right, which was his legal philosophy, or how he thought our external freedom could be secured. Perpetual Peace. In his famous essay Towards a Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, Kant outlined the necessary conditions for ending wars between states. He began the essay by outlining immediate steps that could be taken to reduce the chance of war occurring. Following this, he provided 3 definitive articles that he considered would build a foundation of peace between states. The first was that all states should have the civil constitution of a republic. But Kant was not a civic republican in the tradition of Rousseau, whereby people are required to actively participate in self-government. He has a slightly odd definition of republicanism. He followed the traditional division of types of government into 6 categories. First, he divided them based on their form of sovereignty, which concerned how many people ruled, either one, the few, or the many. So far, so Aristotelian. But his second division between good and bad types of each case, what Kant called their form of government, concerned how they ruled, which he designated as either republican or despotic. But Kant defined a republican form of government as one that had an appropriate separation of the executive power, which was the government, from the legislative power. The strange thing about this was that you could have a single person acting as a legislator, such as a king, and so long as there were many people enforcing the laws, this would still count as a republican form of government. Kant's republican state doesn't require the people to actually participate in making laws or even elect representatives to act on their behalf. A monarchy traditionally understood could be counted as a republic under Kant's definition, so long as there was a separation of powers between the legislature and the executive. He thought that war could be ended forever if states entered into a federation of free states which would protect the independence and rights of each of its members. This would be less than a world government, for it would not create a legislative body higher than the independent sovereigns, but it would be more than a treaty, because it would be a permanent league or federation. He thought that the same reasons individuals would have for exiting a state of nature and creating a state should apply equally to states who find themselves in a state of nature in relation to other states. The League would have an expansive quality and could begin with a few members and gradually expand to include the vast majority of states in the world. There's a question of what coercive force such a federation would have in enforcing action against non-compliant members. He claimed that no state could exercise dominion over another, but only maintain security and freedom, which suggests that perhaps some limited peacekeeping powers might be appropriate. Kant's final article relates to the relationship between a condition of universal hospitality and the notion of world citizenship. His idea of cosmopolitan right is based on the principle that all human beings are equal members of the universal community of humanity. He argued that every state owes foreigners a duty to welcome them as a friend for a limited duration of time to stay on their territory. As different peoples of the world have more and more contact with each other, they could spread the idea of republicanism and a federation of nations, such that humanity could be brought ever closer to the idea of world citizenship. Kant considered the notion of membership of the human race as a necessary supplement to civil laws, as a way of promoting the universal right of humanity. What is Enlightenment? Kant was writing towards the end of a long history throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, which we now call the Enlightenment. This era was a European intellectual movement characterized by a growth of faith placed in human reason. Kant defined the Enlightenment as humanity's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity and human beings' willingness to use their reason without guidance from another. His essay locates humanity on a historical process of self-development and progress. Through the use of our reason, Kant believed we could create more just and rational societies. This was a task for every individual to become more autonomous, but it was also a more general historical process of gradual social change. Our immaturity was self-imposed for Kant due to our own laziness and cowardice. We would prefer to let others think for us and guide our actions, which for Kant was the opposite of freedom and autonomy. Kant wanted individuals to take their status as rational, self-legislating beings seriously and to reason for themselves. We find restrictions on freedom everywhere, but which restriction is harmful to enlightenment? Which restriction is innocent and which advances enlightenment? I reply, the public use of one's reason must be free at all times, and this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind. To achieve this end, Kant argued for what he defined as the freedom to make public use of our reason. This is where we use our reason to address a literary public on political matters. Our private use of reason is confined to when we are performing some kind of administrative or civil role. Kant offered the example of paying taxes. We have the right to argue against the justice of how much tax we're paying, but we have no right to disobey taxation law. A sovereign should have no fear in allowing its subjects to make public use of their reason, as this would lead to a general advancement of humanity. Their motto should be, argue as much as you want, but obey. Kant didn't think that self-government or democracy was necessary for this historical process, so long as individuals were free to use their reason and debate. Kant's republican politics should therefore be seen against the background of this historical process of self-development and progress.